Newcastle United drew 1-1 with Crystal Palace on Saturday, managing only one shot in the entire game with an XG of 0.02. It was yet another poor away performance, and I think the narrative around the club needs to change a little bit. In this video, I'll explain why. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to another Newcastle United analysis video on the channel. Apologies for the quiet weekend. I was away in Manchester, but I'm back now to look at what was a really difficult away game for Newcastle. Yet another one as well. But before we get into that, please do like, share and subscribe to the videos on the channel. Help me grow. 739 subscribers at the last count. Trying to push towards 1,000 over the next few months, because then I can grow the channel even bigger. Hoping to pick up the baton of exploring football a bit more in the coming weeks, particularly in the new year, but it's been a little bit of a slow burner at the start. Please do continue to like, share and subscribe. Build the channel and I can do more stuff. I can go out and do a lot more exciting content for you, and I'm really looking forward to doing so. So please do support the channel. There'll be lots more content coming, as I say, in various different guises. More on that in the coming week. Get straight into this video, and I'm going to come straight out with that. The narrative around the club needs to change, because Newcastle have been told ever since the takeover happened in October 2021, and rightly so by the way, that they've punched above their weight, that there have been limitations in the way, that there are issues that they have to battle against, and they've done really well. And Eddie Howe has done a phenomenal job. Absolutely he has. He picked them up from the relegation zone. They've obviously got into the Champions League, battled against injury issues last season as well. Obviously the PSR situation is a big cloud over what they can achieve. We all know this. But I do think that the narrative needs to change. That is all true, but that can't be the case all the time. Newcastle went to Crystal Palace and absolutely stunk out the place in terms of an attacking force. They had the best team, Sven Botman aside, on the pitch. They had Alexander Isak up front. I know he came off injured. They had Callum Wilson off the bench later on. They had Harvey Barnes off the bench, Gordon on the left. They had Sandro Tonali starting with Bruno Guimaraes in the middle as well. Joe Linton on the pitch. Everything was there for a really good performance, even despite their issues on Monday against West Ham. To muster up just one shot in the entire game and not deserve anything out of the game overall, even though Mark Gahey scored an own goal to put Newcastle ahead, and then Daniel Munoz scored in the last minute, and it feels like a defeat in that sense, and it feels, you know, like they were close, but they didn't deserve anything out of the game. And I think the big problem for me is that when that happens, and it's happened also in terms of performances at Fulham, it's happened in terms of performance, not result, at Wolves. There's been too many lacklustre performances this season against teams that you would expect Newcastle to beat, that I think that the narrative around it needs to change. When that happens, it needs to be mentioned that they've got the quality on the pitch that they do. They've got a striker in Alexander Isak, who most clubs in the world would want. Arsenal certainly do. Chelsea have made inquiries. Manchester City are really keen to sign Bruno Guimaraes, or have been in the last couple of years. Linton signed a new contract. Anthony Gordon signed a new contract to put them on wages that reflect their importance and ability, in the case of Gordon, to protect against interest from Liverpool, who are currently running away with the Premier League title. If you've got those players in the team and then you bring Sandro Tonali in as well, not out of the question that they should be winning the game against Crystal Palace, but also playing in a much better way, playing in an attacking way, finding a way to dominate the ball, finding a way to dominate the game. And I think that's where this underachievement thing, I put this out on Twitter and Blue Sky at the weekend, and it's split opinion. A lot of people did agree with me, but a lot of people sort of said that they pointed out the wage bill situation. They pointed out that people like Sean Longstaff and Dan Burn and other players, Jacob Murphy, have maybe played above themselves, and Eddie Howe has had to deal with a lot of different things. And as I say, they're all true, but that kind of misses the point. I'm talking specifically about games like Crystal Palace, who were in the bottom three before the game started. They'd scored 3 goals at Selhurst Park all season. We're there for the taking, even though Newcastle were coming into the game off the back and licking their wounds from a terrible defeat against West Ham. West Ham as well, they got absolutely stuffed by Arsenal. Both teams played Newcastle off the park in different ways, I think, in the 2 games. And I think that's what my biggest issue is. When you've got the quality of Newcastle on the pitch that they did, and last season we were constantly told about injuries. This year, there was only Sven Botman. I know Isak came off, but there was only Sven Botman from the start who wasn't in that team, who you would say deserves to be in the strongest team that Newcastle have. I think from that perspective, it needs to be said that they have underachieved in these games, and specifically on Saturday when the midfield wasn't quite working again. Even though Sandro Tonali really impressed me, Anthony Gordon scored or set the goal up for Guehi's own goal off the back of a really clever free kick. It hasn't looked right for him for a while, and I think the structure, and I've said so many times about the tactics and the fact that Eddie Howe seems to be wedded to this system. He's a systems manager when nowadays you need to be a principles manager. That all of those things are true, and I think that were evident again. And I think this was the thing that makes me say this about the narrative and the underachieving. And Eddie Howe's always had some reason why it's not worked out. It's always been it's been the narrative around some of the fan base and some of the media as well. I think lots of people have given him a lot of time and a lot of leeway, and as I say, in many cases it's valid, in many cases he's earned it, but not when you're going and playing Crystal Palace with that team on the pitch and having 0.02 XG and having the same issues as you did against Fulham and the same issues as you did against Wolves for long periods. 2 years ago when Newcastle were playing really well and their team was structured, their defence had the way that they were playing, they were really tight-knit, the leadership was there with Kieran Trippier that hasn't been quite replaced, even though Tino Livramento has done well, I think, in his place. That lack of I think mentality monster, you could say, or that sort of that driving force, because Trippier was the standard bearer from the very start. Since he's come out the team and lost his way in the last year or so, Newcastle have really lost their way. And I think since about this time last year, we were saying on the True Faith podcast last night that when they went to PSG and they had that Tino Livramento moment, then they beat Manchester United and it was all looking okay going into December. Then it melted away with the Everton and the Spurs defeats, then the Luton game, then the Forest game. And then since then, Newcastle have never looked quite the same in terms of their structure, in terms of their quality. And actually, I think if you look at Anthony Gordon this season, he's been playing all over the place. Bruno Guimaraes is still not looking his best. He still doesn't look like he's never really played in the position that he really wants to play. Sandro Tonali has never really settled in either. Harvey Barnes doesn't fit into the team. There's too many tactical issues, I think, about the team. They struggle to play the ball in behind for Isak enough as well. I think that's another thing to be said. So there's lots of players, I think, at the moment that Newcastle aren't getting the best out of, and yet Eddie Howe is still wedded to this system. I'm not saying I want Eddie Howe to be sacked. I'm not calling for a question over his future, and I think a lot of people in their response to my point said, were taking it that I was saying Eddie Howe, questions need to be asked about Eddie Howe's future. I think questions need to be asked about the way that the team is being set up, and questions need to be asked about what you can change. But I also think it should be a point of, let's be honest about this. Yes, the lack of recruitment in the summer just gone has stunted their ability to grow this season and really could put a cap on what they can achieve. Arguably, I think it's unlikely that they'll get near a top 4 or top 6 finish at this stage, and that's a direct result of not improving the squad, but also the previous summer, Tonali and Barnes, as good as they've been, the fact that they don't automatically slot into this team, and you're trying to find either a system that does fit them in or a way to fit them into the system, and neither of which quite has worked yet, is still, I think, really impacting the team's development as well. I said at the start of the season that first 11 was definitely good enough to challenge for the Champions League. If you look at the quality in that team, Isak, as I say, is one of the best strikers in the world. Bruno, Tonali, Gordon, off the back of last season. Pep Guardiola at the start of the season was saying he expected Newcastle to be back to what they were 2 years ago, and there have been moments of that against Forest, against Arsenal and against Chelsea in the Cup, for example, but it's few and far between, just as it was in the second half of last season. There were a few games where it looked like Newcastle had something to build from, but there was always a couple of games. It was always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe even 2 steps back and 1 step forward at times as well. And I think that's ultimately a wider problem. And when it comes against Crystal Palace and West Ham and Wolves and Fulham, teams that Newcastle are better than, and certainly on Saturday they had a better team out than Palace did, and Palace were there for the taking with their form this season. There needs to be more than one shot, and I felt like if you listen to Anthony Gordon talking about the perfect away performance it almost was, and Eddie Howe sort of saying it was mystifying that they couldn't attack a bit more, it felt like that was the plan, and it doesn't feel like the team at this stage knows how to change it and knows how to do anything different. I said last week, it's not really a player to take the game by the scruff of the neck in the final third, and I stand by that. That was again evident. This is a team that's built for this system that doesn't quite work, and everybody everybody sort of does their own job. When it works, it's great. When Newcastle get their eye in early on, they're very difficult to stop, and I think that was the case against Arsenal. That was the case against Chelsea. That's been the case a couple of times this season, and it was certainly the case most of the time 2 seasons ago. But but once it doesn't work, it's very difficult to change it and find something else, find a different level, and that was the case on Saturday. And it's really, really difficult, I think, to say that this is what to expect from Newcastle. Lots of people have said that they're a mid-table side, that if you look at the wage bill, that they're performing the way that they are, and they're only 4 points off the Champions League. And I think actually the fact that they're only 4 points off the Champions League, having lost so pitifully to Fulham, having played so poorly against Crystal Palace, having lost from a position of strength against West Ham, those 3 results alone, that would propel them into the top 4, and the season would be looking a lot better. And I think actually it's a more of a criticism that they're that close, and that they've had that opportunity to attack the Champions League places, and they haven't done that. Because as I say, that first team is good enough to play in the Champions League, and the fact that it isn't firing on all cylinders comes down to Eddie Howe, in my opinion. It doesn't mean I'm suggesting that Eddie Howe needs to go. What I am saying is that the narrative around it needs to change. I've always been told about the limitations of the club. When they are the favourites and when they have a team out there that's capable of winning a game like that against Crystal Palace, and they play so poorly, that has to be called out as well. That was a really, really poor performance, and the fact that they sit 11th is an underachievement, because that first team that hasn't had that many injuries this season, it has had a couple, but it hasn't been decimated like it was last year, certainly not yet. To be performing like they are too consistently is difficult, and as I say, it hasn't felt right for a year. Everything 2 years ago worked like clockwork. Everybody knew their jobs. The defence was brilliant. The midfield pressed really well, led by Bruno, who found his way forward. Tonali coming in has maybe disrupted that. Alexander Isak is too isolated. And I think the reason he's too isolated is because they don't play to his strengths by playing the ball through enough. He doesn't get the ball to run on to enough, which is his absolute strength. So when you look at that and you consider the fact that perhaps there's so many players that aren't getting the team isn't getting the best out of, maybe the narrative needs to change. Maybe it isn't all about the fact that they've got so many difficulties to rail against. Maybe it's the fact that they aren't getting the best out of themselves, and that was certainly the case, I think, on Saturday. It doesn't mean, as I say, that Eddie Howe needs to go. It doesn't mean that he can't turn it round, but it has been quite a while. It's been about a year since I think Newcastle were consistently on the up, and actually I think there is a point now where there are a lot of questions around what happens next in terms of the project. Will players need to be sold? I mentioned that last week. It might be best to sell a player and reinvest and unlock a lot of the potential in terms of that's been gate-kept by PSR. And I've noticed that the conversation is widening again, because Aston Villa are very much struggling in the same way that Newcastle did, balancing the Champions League and the Premier League, but the fact that they had to sell a couple of players and they couldn't really strengthen on the level that they wanted to last summer. So that conversation is going on in the background, but specifically in terms of this game against Crystal Palace, they were in the bottom 3, scored 3 goals at home this season, and they were there for the taking, and Newcastle managed 1 meagre shot and never looked like winning the game. They had no complaints when Daniel Munoz scored in the last minute, because they didn't deserve anything out of that game, and that's not really acceptable because of the quality that was on the pitch. And there needs to be more answers. There's enough quality in that squad. Yes, it's a bit unbalanced. Yes, there are issues, but there's enough quality in it to find answers to these things. And as soon as something doesn't go right, because the system is so structured, as soon as anything doesn't go right, there is no answer to that, and that is definitely a problem for the manager to answer. Liverpool on Wednesday, I might be there, I'm not sure yet, but I'll be back with a video regardless. I'm not sure if it'll be live or not, but it could be a very difficult game. I think Newcastle will manage to turn up, and the fact that Alexander Isak, if he's back, if the injury that he suffered isn't too bad, then they might have a good go at Liverpool. But Liverpool are obviously in great form. They dismantled Manchester City yesterday, so it's going to be a very, very tough game before Brentford at the weekend. Really, really busy December coming up, so there'll be lots of content on the channel. Like, share and subscribe. I really appreciate all the support, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.